All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Shorebird Steward Volunteer Training. We have a lot to cover, so I'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome to all new and returning volunteers. I'd like to start with a quick overview. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background about the National Audubon Society, move into Audubon, South Carolina, and then our Shorebird Steward program. And then the next section, which is going to be the bulk of this presentation, is going to be about the birds and then about the people and how to be an effective steward. So we'll dive right in. So the National Audubon Society is a national nonprofit. We organize our work based on flyways. So as you can see, these brightly colored lines, we organize our work based on those flyways. And of course, in South Carolina, we are in the Atlantic Flyway. And as you can see, we are a huge web of different chapters, different state and regional offices. So Audubon, South Carolina is the state office of that National Audubon Society. And so you are connected to a huge web of partnerships that are working together to protect birds in the places that they live. We are going to be focusing today on our coastal work in Audubon, South Carolina, but we do have some other areas where we do work, including working land. So we have a huge ranching program out in the west. Clean water, bird-friendly communities, and of course, climate. We have a huge web of bird stewardship programs along the coast of the United States, and we are working out in South America, in Audubon Americas. So we're building that program out, but it all started with one island out in Texas back in 1923. And now we are up to over 500 sites with 1,300 volunteers across all these states that you can see here in green on this map. And all of this stewardship helps to inform our general coastal conservation work and our policy work. And you can see this little graphic here in the bottom corner. That's something that all of our stewardship programs use. And of course, this shared messaging helps connect us throughout the different flyways. And as I mentioned, South Carolina here in the light blue is in the Atlantic Flyway. And South Carolina is home to about 187 miles of coastline, almost 3,000 tidal shorelines, and 35 barrier islands. So we work along a huge geographic scale here in the state. Of course, this work wouldn't be possible without all of our partners, both within the Audubon network and outside of the Audubon network, like those watching this video. That brings us to Audubon, South Carolina. Like I mentioned, we are the state branch of that national nonprofit, the National Audubon Society, and our coastal work is organized under people, places, and policies. So that's how we inform our coastal work. And of course, like I mentioned, we're working all along the South Carolina coast to protect all of those migratory stopover habitats, wintering sites, and important breeding sites for our shore and seabirds. People, of course, we wouldn't be able to do this work without folks like you who are watching this video, our volunteers, and our myriad of different partners. So these are just a few that I have listed here on the screen, and you guys are a huge part of this partnership. Without our volunteers, we wouldn't be able to do a lot of the work that we do. All along the coast, we work at all kinds of different places. This is a photo of one of our most recent conservation successes, Crab Bank Seabird Sanctuary. It was a huge multi-partner project that was completed back in 2021 in December, and it hosted its first nesting birds since 2017 last summer in 2022. But we do have other sites all along the coast. We have our farthest northern site is Huntington Beach State Park up in Murrells Inlet, with the furthest southern site being Bull Point down on Pritchard's Island in the Beaufort area. This year, we are hosting volunteers at 13 different sites, but 2 of these sites I do want to mention are more autonomous. So I do not coordinate volunteers for those sites, but if anyone is interested at working at Kiowa Island or Seabrook Island, I'm happy to connect you to their stewardship program. Oh, next slide. So our last little branch of what we do here for our coastal work in Audubon, South Carolina is our policy work. And a lot of what stewards do on the beach is all about being an advocate for these birds, whether or not you're in Capitol Hill talking to different legislators, while you're out there talking to beachgoers on the beach, you are advocating for these coastal birds. So you are an advocate within South Carolina. But we do have a more formal policy agenda, and I have some of it listed up here, but I'd be happy to connect you to our policy director should anyone be interested in getting more involved with that. But this year, a big talking point is horseshoe crabs and the roof of red knot. And we're also working to ensure a resilient coastline and promoting different climate solutions to ensure that those frontline communities that are on the coast are able to be sustainable in their work. So why stewardship? We'll talk a little bit about that. So overall, coastal birds worldwide are declining. And when I say coastal birds, for the purpose of this presentation, that's going to include shorebirds and seabirds. And we'll talk about the distinctions between those a little later. But our migratory shorebirds are oftentimes long distance migrants. So throughout their life cycle, as they're stopping at different points in South America, the Caribbean, the Southeast, the Northeast, and even up as far north as the Arctic, they're suffering a lot of different threats at all of those sites that are causing their population decline. And then our wintering shorebirds are those birds that are here for a majority of the time throughout the winter season. And in South Carolina, it may not be the winter that most people see with snow, but from around October to about March, we see a lot of birds that hang out here in South Carolina along our coast. And what they're doing is resting and refueling from their very energy intensive breeding seasons throughout the summer. And so they're suffering repeated threats along the South Carolina coast because they're here for a long period of time. And finally, nesting sites for these shorebirds and seabirds are very limited, especially with a lot of coastal development in the state. We are lucky that we do have a lot of protected coastal land, but with a lot of development throughout, again, those long migratory stretches, they're losing a lot of different sites that they can nest on. And this is a picture of some least terns nesting on a gravel rooftop. And we'll talk a little bit more about least terns in a bit. But what is stewardship? Why do we do it in the first place? Again, is for those reasons, we're protecting these birds. But the biggest misconception is for shorebird stewardship is that you have to be an expert. That is not the case at all. And I can speak to that. I started this job with very little knowledge about shorebirds, but it is very easy to learn just a little bit of knowledge that can help encourage people to prevent disturbance to these shorebirds. So I will not expect you to name every bird here on this screen, but I can also help connect you to resources if you do want to learn more about these shorebirds and seabirds. But by the end of this presentation, you will have enough knowledge to get out there on the beach and hopefully inspire beachgoers to help us protect these shorebirds and seabirds. So it's very simple. I kind of mentioned this, but our main goal is preventing human disturbance to resting, nesting, and overwintering coastal birds through education and awareness. So we're not out there to write tickets or be law enforcement. We're out there to inspire folks to know about these birds, create that awareness, and hopefully give them enough education to understand why they need protection. And this work all began back in 2016. So our Shorebird Steward program began in 2016 with just 3 different sites. And as you can see from this timeline, we've grown immensely in that time. We were up to 12 sites last summer. This year, 13 sites. With last year, we hosted 124 volunteers with nearly 3,700 volunteer hours, which is just an incredible amount of work that our volunteers are doing. And so I do want to thank you guys for being here. And with that little bit of background knowledge, we're going to move right on into the birds and doing some beach bird identification. And we're going to talk about some 5 different species that we're going to focus on as shorebird stewards. So if you need a break to kind of digest, feel free to pause this video, but I will keep moving forward. Like I mentioned, coastal birds for the purposes of this presentation are going to be those shorebirds and seabirds. So what is the main difference between these birds? Of course, on the beach, you may also see a lot of different kinds of birds, but shorebirds, very aptly named, they forage for food along the shoreline. So that's one of the main differences in shorebirds and seabirds is what they eat. So the shorebirds are going to be the birds that you see pecking in the wet sand, maybe going into the marsh area, going into the dunes, looking for those crustaceans, maybe some worms, insect larvae, those invertebrates that live just beneath the sand. Whereas seabirds are going to be the ones you see foraging for fish from the ocean. So you'll see those dive bombing like the one here, the least tern in this photo, looking for some fish. The other difference that they have is how they nest. So shorebirds are solitary nesters. We call them cryptic nesters as well, because oftentimes they're very difficult to see nesting because they blend in so well to their environment. Like you can see right here on the left picture is a Wilson's plover incubating a nest. When you're on the beach, if you're unaware of these birds, they can be very difficult to see. And we can talk about how that has an effect on their nesting here in a bit. But seabirds are very conspicuous nesters. You can tell when you have a colony of seabirds that are nesting in an area. Colonies can range from 10, 20 birds up to thousands of birds in one area. So this picture here on the right is a royal tern colony. And a lot of these seabirds typically nest on our barrier islands because there is no access for predators to get to those islands oftentimes. And there's less human disturbance out there, and they just have typically more space to be able to create those big colonies. But again, seabirds, colony nesters, and they typically start to nest in April, where shorebirds start a little bit earlier in March, but they can be nesting up until August. So we'll see them throughout the summer, which of course in South Carolina is the busiest time of year for our beaches. And depending on the time of year, so I mentioned those nesting birds, we'll talk about that, but depending on the time of year, you're going to see different species on the beach. So in the spring and the fall is when we're going to be seeing those migratory birds. And so shorebirds, I mentioned earlier, are very long distance migrants oftentimes. And so when they pick certain places for stopping over, it is very important for them, very crucial to be able to rest and nest, to be able to have enough energy to make it to their breeding sites. So a lot of their behavior while they're here on our beaches depends on the tide. At low tide, these shorebirds that are feeding along the shoreline are going to be looking in that wet sand, looking for food. You'll see them pecking along the shoreline. Whereas at high tide, they're going to be roosting or resting. So oftentimes you'll see them either in bigger groups. Some species you'll see hanging out by themselves or in smaller groups. But that's their life cycle while they're here. At low tide, they're foraging. At high tide, they're resting. And with all the different birds, you see them hanging out on the beach in the wet sand. They're not all looking for the same food. So I have some examples up here on this slide. A lot of our shorebirds have very different sizes of beaks. And a lot of times that's how you can tell what they're eating. So these longer beaked birds are going to be probers, is what we call them, probers. They are probing deep into the sand to get the food that's a little deeper in the sand. So you got different crustaceans, clams, maybe some isopods down deeper, worms, things like that. Whereas our shorter beaked shorebirds, like these plovers here on the right, are going to be gleaners. So they're gleaning food off close to the surface or just below the surface. And you can see kind of in the furthest left graphic at the bottom, there's some ghost shrimp, some mole crabs. Our Wilson's plovers love marsh crabs, fiddler crabs. In the middle picture, there's a little toothbrush scraping up what looks like mud. So these shorebirds sometimes will often feed on what we call biofilm, which is kind of that mucousy layer a lot of times that we see, especially in that pluff mud. Sometimes they will glean nutrients off of the top of that biofilm. And then, of course, I mentioned horseshoe crabs have a huge connection to our shorebirds. Some shorebirds, like the red knot, even time their migration to be able to line up with the breeding season of these horseshoe crabs. So in the furthest right bottom picture, you'll see what looks like little green dots on somebody's finger. Those are actually horseshoe crab eggs, and they are full of nutrients. So shorebirds will oftentimes seek out these eggs, and female horseshoe crabs can lay thousands of eggs in the summer. So they are a very quick, nutrient-dense food that helps shorebirds pack on the weight that they need to be able to make it to their breeding sites. And so that brings me to nesting, our nesting shorebirds. Here in South Carolina, we have several different species of shorebirds that nest on our beaches. But those migratory birds that we see, a lot of times are often stopping over here in South Carolina to be able to fuel up and get ready for their migration even further north into the Arctic. So that's where a lot of the shorebirds we see in the spring and the fall are going or coming from. And I have put a little red star next to some of the species that do nest in the Arctic. So our semi-palmated plovers, dunlin, sandpipers, dowitchers, whimbrel, and red knot sanderling are all very common species that we see here, sometimes throughout the year, but typically in the spring and the fall. And they're going up to the Arctic to be able to nest because one, there's few predators, and a lot of times there's a lot of great food available. And then they'll fly back down south, sometimes through different routes. They may not always stop over in South Carolina again, but they are in the Arctic nesting throughout the summer. So throughout the summer here in South Carolina, we do have a couple of really cool shorebirds that are nesting directly on our beaches. We have the willet, the Wilson's plover, the American oystercatcher, the black-necked stilt, and the killdeer are all shorebirds that nest here in South Carolina. But a lot of them don't necessarily always nest on our beaches. So Wilson's plover, you'll see a lot of times, American oystercatcher, this killdeer here in the bottom, the very last row on the right, they look a lot like Wilson's plover, but they can nest in very different places, even inland. They'll lay their eggs. I've seen them nest in gravel parking lots, inland Virginia, where I grew up. And killdeer look a lot like Wilson's plover, like I said, but with two neck bands as opposed to one, like the Wilson's plover. Our willet like to nest in marsh grasses, so they can be often difficult to see nesting. But our American oystercatcher and Wilson's plover, we will see a lot of times at several of our sites. And then this is a graphic from our partner at Fish and Wildlife. It's a cool way to just display what the birds are doing throughout the year. So I mentioned that spring migration, birds are coming up from, a lot of times there's southern wintering sites, so South America, the Caribbean, further states, southeast, like Texas and Florida. They're coming up. Sometimes they can stop over here in South Carolina. They'll hang out for a few weeks, up to maybe a month or so. And then they're going to head even further north to the Arctic, where they're going to be breeding. And then they'll come back down in the fall. And then some of our shorebird and seabird species will spend the winter here. So that is, again, August. You'll see them start trickling down in August. With a lot of them you'll see in September and October. They'll hang out with us until springtime when they're ready to migrate north again. And that brings me to our focal species. So this year, for returning volunteers, I have added the American oystercatcher as part of our focal 5. So this year, we're going to be talking more in depth about these 5 species, but I'd like to make sure folks know that despite just focusing on these 5 species in our training, all of the work that we do helps protect the other shorebirds and seabirds that use the same habitat that our focal 5 species do. The reason we focus on just a handful of species in this training is to be able to have, some quick talking points that you can whip out and from your back pocket to talk to these beachgoers, because oftentimes you're only going to be talking to beachgoers to prevent that human disturbance for a couple of minutes. So you want to be able to have these really inspiring facts and stories to be able to tell them and hook them in to get them to love the birds as much as you do. And at this point, I know I threw a lot at you in a little amount of time. So if you want to pause the presentation, take a break, feel free. And at any point throughout this presentation, if you have questions, you want to note them down, feel free to shoot me an email. I have my email listed on our website. But we'll go ahead and jump into our focal 5. So we'll start with one of our wintering shorebirds, and those are the birds that are here for up to 9 months of the year. It is called the piping plover. And this little plover has a very short beak. And this photo is an example of a piping plover in their winter plumage. They do not nest here, but they are here for a majority of the year. And here we go. They will breed along the Atlantic coast as far south as northern North Carolina. So very close to South Carolina, but we do not see them breeding here in the state. But they have 3 distinct breeding populations. So this Great Plains within the northern US and Canada, the Great Lakes region, which is a federally endangered breeding population, and along the Atlantic coast up into Canada. So the Great Plains and the Canadian breeding populations are federally threatened, whereas the Great Lakes breeding population is federally endangered. So although they don't breed here, I wanted to show you guys what their chicks look like. Very small birds, about the size of a hand. Their chicks are about the size of a cotton ball. And in their breeding plumage, as you can see in these pictures, their beaks kind of look like little number 2 pencils. They're orange at the base with a black tip. And as spring is coming around, before they fly up to the Arctic, and maybe right as they come back down from their breeding season in the fall, you might be able to see them in this breeding plumage. But they have a very unique foraging technique, and I'll go ahead and play this video. But they have a very unique technique in that they take their foot and they vibrate it on the top of the sand. So that is either to scare up invertebrates that are just underneath the surface so that it makes it easier for them to grab them, or they might be using it to kind of feel the vibrations in the sand to locate that prey. This is an example. You can see them wiggling their little foot. It's a cool little technique, and if you're on the beach long enough, you can often see them doing that. Go to the next slide. So what you'll see oftentimes here on the beach, I've included several different pictures. They are very small birds, and they do look very similar to our semi-palmated plover. So on the bottom left-hand side, the farthest left picture, you'll see the left bird is a semi-palmated plover, whereas the bird on the right that's sitting on the sand is a piping plover. The semi-palmated plovers, despite being the same size, you can tell them apart by one, the semi-palmated plover has a darker brown plumage, whereas the piping plover has a lighter gray plumage. So I was taught semi-palmated look like wet sand, whereas piping plovers look like dry sand. So that's how you can kind of tell them apart. And oftentimes semi-palmated plovers are in bigger groups, whereas piping plovers are going to be more solitary or in a lot smaller groups because they are very threatened and their populations have declined pretty drastically. So you can see on the screen these red circles here in the bottom. On the beach, they can be pretty difficult to see. So it's a great resource to be able to have a pair of binoculars or a scope or some kind of awesome photos. We do have a lot of resources, but showing folks the photos or the birds in action on the beach is a great way to connect with people. But a lot of times these piping plovers are also banded. So in the bottom right-hand corner, the top right-hand picture, pretty much all of these pictures have banded piping plovers, and those colored bands will oftentimes tell you where they were banded. So there's a great resource that I can share with folks that tells you where to report a banded piping plover, and they usually respond pretty quickly with the story of that piping plover. So that's another cool resource to learn more about individual birds you might be seeing on the beach. So some talking points, everything I kind of just mentioned here while talking through this presentation, but they breed from April to July in 3 distinct breeding populations. So that Great Lakes region and the Great Plains and Atlantic Seaboard region. The Great Lakes, again, federally threatened. They used to have pairs that were between 500 and 800 every year, but currently they are hovering around 70 pairs every summer. In 2022, they had 72 breeding pairs with 193 chicks. I'm sorry, 73 total breeding pairs with about 193 chicks that were counted. Excuse me, so that was a pretty good year for the Great Lakes. The Great Plains and Atlantic regions typically host about 2,000 breeding pairs in total. So they're not quite at the breeding level right now to take them off the federally endangered or federally threatened list. So their populations have drastically declined in big part due to people, so that coastal development and human disturbance factor, dogs, predators, coastal development, and extreme weather. Like I mentioned, they do that foot foraging technique, and what they're doing is looking for marine worms, fly larvae, beetles, insects, things like that, just under the surface. And recent research that has come out last year out of South Carolina from Fish and Wildlife and South Carolina DNR has found that inlets are an incredibly important habitat for piping plover because it has a lot of their important food sources. So those inlets, kind of like at Kiowa and Seabrook, where the rivers or creeks are coming out into the ocean, it provides a lot of great foraging habitat for these birds. And I mentioned we're a wintering site. So they do typically overwinter in the southeast, sometimes in the Caribbean, oftentimes in the Caribbean, I should say. Also in Texas, Florida, Georgia. So, oops, went too fast. So one of my coworkers' dads is a comic artist, I should say. And he created some of these really cool comics about shorebirds. So if you want to read through this, feel free to pause this presentation, but it's another cool way to teach about shorebirds and seabirds. The next up on our focal 5 is the migratory red knot. And so again, when they show up here in the spring, they're not always going to be in that bright red breeding plumage that we see oftentimes. They're kind of going to look like this gray bird, black speckles. And as the spring moves into summer, you'll start to see them change into that really red, distinct color that they have, like in these photos right here. So these are really long distance migrants. They can fly up to 19,000 miles in 1 year. They usually overwinter down in South America. Sometimes we get some overwintering red knot here in South Carolina, but oftentimes they're down here in as far south into Tierra del Fuego down in Chile. And in the springtime, usually in February, they're going to start migrating up the coast of South America, and they're going to stop over along the Atlantic coast. And in South Carolina, we are a very important stopover habitat. So what that means is they hang out here for a couple weeks up to a couple months. There was a study done last year where we learned a lot more about these red knots. So you can see here on this map to the left, this was a couple of individually tagged red knot. And so you can see South Carolina was actually found to be one of the last stopping points before a big portion of the red knot population flew directly from South Carolina to the Arctic to nest. And so they're flying up into these, up here in graphic A, you can see these orange territories right here. That is their breeding ground. So they are flying extremely long distances nonstop to get to their breeding ground. So the time that they're here in South Carolina is incredibly important for them to be able to rest and refuel. And what they're eating and doing here in South Carolina is they're looking for invertebrates. In particular, this is one of the birds that times their migration, northern migrations, with the breeding season of the horseshoe crabs. So they are able to eat those very nutrient-dense horseshoe crabs. And they'll also, before horseshoe crabs start breeding, they'll also feed on coquina clams. So those little clams that you see creating those bubbles in the sand when the waves come in. And while in the Arctic, they are nesting. So these photos here on the right are the breeding grounds of the red knot. You can see that red belly color really blends into the scenery up in the Arctic. And again, they are a shorebird, so they're very well camouflaged because they are cryptic nesters. And so what you'll see here on the beach are oftentimes huge flocks of red knot, up to thousands of red knot in one spring season. In particular, they love those inlets. Again, kind of like the piping plovers love foraging on inlets. So a recent study that came out last year was found that the Kiowa and Seabrook Island area, there's that Captain Sam Spit area for those who may be familiar. They switch between Kiowa and Seabrook Islands, and we had kind of known that is a very important stopover site, but last year we were able to quantify that about 41% of the existing Atlantic coast population of the roofer red knot depends on Kiowa and Seabrook Islands while they're here in South Carolina. And I mentioned too, some of that research that came from South Carolina DNR also found that those birds were flying directly from South Carolina to the Arctic. So there's a lot of research going into these birds because they are federally threatened, which is a big talking point. Their populations have declined about 70% just in the last 20 years because, again, they're long distance migrants. They're facing a ton of threats throughout their entire life cycle. So they have oftentimes been hunted in the past down in South America. In the US, they face threats like human disturbance, the coastal development, so they're losing some of that foraging habitat. They build up a lot of their fat from horseshoe crabs. So if there's a decline in horseshoe crab populations, that can greatly affect these red knot. And I mentioned one of the longest migrations for birds, not the longest, not quite, but one of the longest. In fact, one banded red knot that had a lifespan of about 13 years flew from the distance of the Earth to the moon and halfway back in its lifetime, which is just helps put into perspective a little bit just how far these birds are going. And I mentioned our South Carolina coast is an important stopover habitat, and a lot of these birds will gather in huge flocks, and they're doing what we call staging. So they're preparing for their northern migration. So there we have a lot of beaches that are a popular staging area for these huge flocks of red knot. They're here for about 84 days and oftentimes have already flown an incredible distance to get here. Some people say they look like little sewing machines when they're feeding along that shoreline looking for those horseshoe crab eggs or coquina clams. And they're very dependent on our coastline and other staging sites along the Atlantic coast to build up that fat, because if they're not able to rest and refuel enough, they can either have an unsuccessful breeding season or they can die in flight to the Arctic. So very important stopover point. And in particular here in South Carolina, two important staging sites are Harbor and Hunting Island and Kiowa and Seabrook Islands. And another little cartoon, if you guys want to pause and read that. The third of our focal five this year is the least tern. So it is actually a seabird, not a shorebird, but you can see from this photo, they do nest here on our beaches in South Carolina. Oh, go to the next slide. They have very distinct courtship behaviors. So what they do is called a fish wiggle, very scientific name, but the male of the species will go get what they think is the best, shiniest fish, and they'll present it to the female, and they will wiggle it in front of the female, and the female gets to decide whether or not they want to pair up for the breeding season. And in this photo series, she said no, but they are successful a lot of times, and the female will accept the fish and they will begin breeding. So they breed, they are seabirds, so they breed in pretty big colonies. They can have small colonies, anywhere from like a couple birds to a couple hundreds of birds. And this is a very interesting species because they have adapted to nest in South Carolina a lot of times on gravel rooftops. So last summer, they had about 40% of their breeding population in South Carolina nesting on artificial areas. So areas that include pebble rooftops, so the gravel rooftops, dredge spoil sites, places where they aren't naturally occurring in the past. So every site that they have that is natural is extremely important to their nesting success. So a lot of times I mentioned you'll see that fish wiggle, you'll see pretty big flocks. They're very defensive, so they will dive bomb as a protection method. So that's something you can communicate with beachgoers. If they don't want birds buzzing at their head, it is best to stay away from those nesting areas. And throughout the spring season, a lot of our shorebird partners and volunteers will put in a massive effort to be able to put up these signs that you see here on the bottom row, this yellow sign. There are other variations, but we put up symbolic fencing is what we call it, because it is temporary, but we will close certain areas of the beach so that people know that there are shorebirds nesting there. So like I mentioned, these are oftentimes temporary, so we will put them up in the spring before the birds start to breed, and we'll take them down again in the fall. Most times we have string in between each of these posts to kind of create a giant fence in a way to communicate to people that it is important that we stay out of that area. These chicks are very reliant on their parents for the first few weeks of their life because, like I mentioned, they are seabirds, so they're getting their food from the ocean. So before these chicks can fly, they are reliant on their parents to bring them food. And both of the breeding pair will take turns incubating that nest. And so those nests are laid directly on the beach. And I do not have a picture of least tern eggs, but you can kind of see in this top middle picture, it looks like there's one bird that is sitting on maybe one more egg, or maybe it's shading another chick, but they will nest directly on our beach. And so while they're here, again, they're nesting, they probably get here around end of March. They're going to start pairing up. But here's some talking points. We have about 671 nesting pairs based on data collected by STDNR in 2015, and that showed a 30% decline in that species. So that prompted them to list them as state threatened. So while they're not federally listed like that red knot and piping plover, they're listed as state threatened in our South Carolina Wildlife Action Plan. They do that really cute courting behavior where they wiggle the fish in front of them And I mentioned that last summer they had about 40% of that 671 nesting pairs nesting on artificial sites. So that leaves about 60% nesting on more natural sites. The nests, again, are very shallow scrapes in the sand. And so you'll see some shorebird nesting examples in a minute, but all of our shorebirds and seabirds nests are typically scrapes in the sand, aside from pelicans that build their nests. But we'll talk about how that can be great for camouflaging them for predator protection, but it can be dangerous if humans are not aware that their nests are on the beach. It takes about 20 to 25 days for the nest to be incubated, and we'll talk about how it can be dangerous to scare the birds up off the nest here in a minute. And here's the least tern cartoon. Feel free to pause. But we'll move on to our fourth bird of the focal five, the nesting Wilson's plover. The Wilson's plover is a shorebird. They love fiddler crabs, as you can see in this picture. So they are going to be one of those cryptic nesters that we have on our beach. So here's a great example of some photos of just how camouflaged these birds can be. So while the least tern also lay their nests in the sand, you can oftentimes see that there's a least tern colony nesting in an area. You can oftentimes hear them as well. But Wilson's plovers, you may not know that they're nesting in the area. They're very well camouflaged, their eggs and their chicks. And I think I mentioned plover birds, when they're first born, they look like the size of a cotton ball. So they can be very hard to miss while you're out on the beach, especially if you don't know they're there. So they have this very distinctive defensive technique. So unlike the least tern, they are not going to be dive bombing us if we get too close to a nest. They're going to do what we call a broken wing display. So I'll play that for you guys now. You can see in this video, the bird is acting as if it's injured. And all plover species will do this broken wing display. And they do that when there is a predator or what they perceive as a predator. So humans or dogs can be perceived as predators. They'll do that to distract the predator away from the nest. So they'll pretend they have a broken wing, kind of scurry away from the nest and the chicks to get the predator away from them. And then once the predator is far enough away from their nest or chicks, they will fly off. So that is kind of their tricky little way to protect their eggs and chicks. And if you ever see that on the beach, it means you are way too close and there is likely a nest in the area. So you need to, the best way to remedy that is to just back up and walk the other way or make a huge arc to give these birds enough space. Move on to the next slide. So what you will see on the beach with Wilson's plover, there we go, is that they blend in very well to the sand. Oftentimes you can hear their little peep call before you see them. But these birds are a little bit bigger than that piping plover and that semi-palmated plover that I mentioned before. They look very similar to killdeer, but the way I kind of remember it is killdeer has 2 L's and 2 E's, so they have 2 neck bands. But the Wilson's plover just has 1 neck band, so that's a great way to tell them apart. They're a nesting species. They blend in super well. Again, like I mentioned with the least tern, we are going to put signage around where these birds are suspected to be nesting or where they have historically nested in the past, because we do try to put up this signage before the birds actually lay their nests to prevent any disturbance. It would have the opposite effect if we were walking around in their nesting area while they had eggs on the ground. But you can see from a lot of these photos, these birds, especially when they're on the lookout for any predators, will stand very tall. And a lot of times you can see them on the tops of dunes, just on the lookout to make sure there's no predators, or if there's something nearby, they are very alert. So this middle picture all the way here on the far right is a good picture of that. Very alert, they stand very tall. Both birds in the pair will incubate the nest. And as opposed to the least tern chicks that I mentioned that depend on their parents, shorebird chicks are what we call precocial. So that just means that as soon as they hatch, they're able to get up and walk around, whereas seabird chicks are altricial, which means it takes them a while to be able to walk around and leave the nest, and they're very dependent on their parents. So a lot of times, if there's a Wilson's plover nest in the area, you can see the 2 adult Wilson's plovers kind of running around, watching their chicks, teaching their chicks how to feed and look for those fiddler crabs that they love. And Wilson's plover chicks can oftentimes travel a couple miles away from their original hatch site. So that was found out from a study down in Georgia. So although they may have a nest in one area, once those chicks hatch, they can be running around anywhere on a nearby beach. So it's very important that once we know that a Wilson's plover nest has hatched, or around the time when they should have chicks, so middle of the summer, that we are letting beachgoers know that there might be chicks on the beach running around. So it's important to watch where you step, because these birds can be very difficult to see, and they oftentimes love little depressions in the sand to be able to hide. So any tire tracks, footprints, things like that, you can sometimes see them hiding behind that. And you can often see them actually using the rack line as well. So those piles of rack that come up with the tide, they will use that to either maybe look for some bugs for some food, but they can also use it to hide from predators or perceived predators. We'll go to the next slide. So those talking points I mentioned. In South Carolina, the last time we did a state census with SCDNR led that charge, they counted about 375 nesting pairs in the state, which qualified them to be state threatened. So again, not federally listed, but they're state listed. They have a declining population due to a loss of habitat and human disturbance. They are quote unquote most likely to tolerate disturbance, but again, it can greatly affect their breeding success. I mentioned they're often seen alone or in pairs. So shorebirds that are nesting here in South Carolina, again, very cryptic, not in those huge colonies like seabirds. And they'll stand very erect, especially when they are alert to a potential predator. They'll usually lay 3 eggs, and that's not always to say that all of these eggs will be successful. But both parents do tend to those eggs in the nest. They'll take turns incubating, and these chicks can start to fly in about 21 days. And one of the biggest human disturbance issues is scaring those adults off of the nest, because as most folks know who have experienced summer in South Carolina, that sand can get very hot. And so those eggs can cook in a matter of minutes. And if they're leaving chicks exposed to that hot sun, they can overheat, or it leaves them exposed to nearby predators that can more easily grab those chicks. And here's the cartoon for the Wilson's plover. And that brings us to the last of our focal 5, the American oyster catcher. So for returning stewards, again, this is a new addition this year. These birds can be seen year-round here in South Carolina, but that doesn't always mean you're seeing the same individuals year-round. So what's cool about these oyster catchers, as you can see, they're pretty conspicuous. They have a very large orange beak to help them eat oysters. They have a very strong beak, and what they're able to do is kind of pry open maybe a pre-opened oyster or clam, and they're able to cut the abductor muscle of that clam, or I'm sorry, of that oyster, and slurp up the clam. They can be very territorial, especially during breeding season. So oftentimes you can see them, I think I have a video in the next slide, you can see them doing this bowing behavior. So the pair will go after the other oyster catcher that may be getting too close to their nest, and they will bow and make really loud noises. And so that's when you know that an oyster catcher nest is in the area. A lot of times they will nest on shell rakes or shell mounds. So you can kind of see in this bottom picture, it's a bunch of oyster shells with several rack pieces along, and they'll lay their nest directly there. But we oftentimes see them on laying eggs on our beaches as well in that sand. Their chicks, there's a chick picture right here on the left and up at the top. They have black tips on their beak, and that's kind of how you can tell that there's a juvenile, that it is a juvenile, is they have the black tip on their beak. Mature adults will have a fully orange beak. And so I mentioned they can be very territorial. And so this is a game camera video from, I think, down in Florida, maybe. But it kind of shows a territorial dispute between these oyster catcher pairs. So you can see it incubating the nest, and another oyster catcher will come up in just a second. And the pair will get up and do that bowing motion. And you can see that other oyster catcher flew away in the distance. So that is their territorial display. These birds, not only breed here in South Carolina in the summertime, we also host about 33% of the Atlantic coast population in the winter. So about 1/3 of their total population overwinters in South Carolina. So I mentioned again, we see them year round, but oftentimes the birds that breed here may not necessarily stay here throughout the entire year. You can see here on the far right, this bird has very obvious bands on the tops of their legs. And you can tell by the band color where that bird was banded. So South Carolina has blue bands, but oftentimes we'll see different colored bands. And we do see all of these bands usually here in South Carolina in the wintertime. And so something that's very important to learn more about these oyster catchers is during that winter time. So when they're here in the best time to what we call recite, which just means looking for birds, noting their bands, their band code, and then reporting that data to breedingbirds.org, or I'm sorry, bandedbirds.org, or there's an American Oyster Catcher Working Group, which I'm happy to share information on that. But reporting those birds that you see and where you see them is very important to learn more about where they're migrating after the breeding season. And here on the far left is a picture of what a typical oyster catcher flock will look like in the wintertime. They can be up in the hundreds. Oftentimes, what they do is they flock up in those huge numbers around high tide. So the best time to recite these birds is about 2 hours before or 2 hours after high tide. And they have a very high site fidelity. So oftentimes we know where these flocks are going to be just because they come back from year to year. And so what you'll see on the beach with oyster catchers, again, they're here year round. So you can point them out on the beach almost at any time of the year. And they're very conspicuous. So they have that bright orange beak. The only other bird that we have that looks similar with that bright orange beak would be a black skimmer. But you can see they do breed here in this top corner. You can see that the chicks blend in pretty well to this oyster catcher rake. There's a chick in the middle between the two adult birds. So no matter the time of year, these birds need our help to protect them from human disturbance. And those talking points. So from year to year, we have about 400 nesting pairs in the state. And again, that was done by a census from SCDNR. It was found that they needed to be listed as highest priority, so not state threatened, quite like those Wilson's plovers or least terns, but still a very high priority because of their population decline. I mentioned they get very territorial during nesting season. They make very loud calls, and they do that kind of bowing gesture when they feel threatened. Often they'll nest on oyster mounds. Again, they eat oysters, that's their favorite food, so they will often be foraging on oyster mounds as well. We have about 1/3 of the Atlantic coast population that overwinters in South Carolina, so that's about 3,000 individuals, give or take. And they use that really strong bill to be able to cut the abductor muscle of the oyster. And so with that, here is the oyster catcher cartoon. And so I like to make sure to reiterate the umbrella effect that I mentioned earlier. So although we do talk about those 5 species more in depth, and those are the 5 focal species that especially newer stewards or beginning birders, those are the ones to get to know while you're out on the beach stewarding. So you're able to talk about more in depth about these Wilson's plovers or red knot or piping plover to these beachgoers that you only have a few minutes with. But that umbrella effect does protect several other species that are suffering from population decline. So those black skimmers, I mentioned they look similar to oyster catchers because of the orange beak, but they are a type of seabird that nests here in South Carolina. And you'll see them oftentimes skimming the surface of the water to look for fish because they have a lower mandible that is longer than the upper mandible. So they look kind of goofy, but that lower mandible has very sensitive nerve endings to be able to feel a fish while they're skimming the top of that water and snap shut to be able to eat the fish. Willet, again, another nesting species, but they could very easily decline pretty quickly due to human disturbance because they nest on our beaches in the marshes. Sanderling, another popular species that we see on the beach that that can easily be threatened by humans. Whimbrel are a really cool species. We actually had a recent discovery, and there was a 10-minute documentary made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where they talked about how there was a discovery at DeVoe. So researchers at SCDNR found that it was about 20,000 birds roosted on DeVoe Bank at night. So DeVoe Bank is one of those barrier islands along the South Carolina coast. And on our Audubon website, and that 10-minute documentary is also up on YouTube. If you just look up Discovery at DeVoe, it's a beautifully recorded documentary that shows just how important South Carolina is for these declining birds. And then, of course, the ruddy turnstone, another pretty conspicuous species that we can see because they have these bright orange legs. And then during the breeding season, they're very brightly colored feathers, but can be very threatened by human disturbance. And so that brings me to our last section of this presentation, the people. So feel free to take a minute, take it all in. I know it's a lot of information. Feel free to pause this video, but I will keep on going with people. So these birds are oftentimes facing so many different threats to their survival. So predation, we've got climate change, sea level rise, avian diseases, reduced prey base. We've got stronger weather every year. They've got a lot going against them. And so to put human disturbance against them as well is just another factor that they have to face, but it is something preventable. Whereas other things that are more bigger scale, things we can't really address in a 5-minute conversation on the beach. So we've got climate change. That's something that is a long-term thing that we have to address, but it is a threat to these birds. We've got very strong storms and hurricanes, so especially during the summer breeding season here in South Carolina, if we get a strong hurricane or a big rainstorm, it can wash out those eggs where those birds are breeding. These birds know to breed above the high tide line, but oftentimes, as you guys know, who may have experienced the South Carolina weather, we would get very strong, very high tides, especially in the spring. With those full and new moons, we get what we call king tides, where they're just higher than average tides that can greatly affect birds that may not be fledged yet. So birds that can't quite fly and escape the higher ground. And of course, eggs can't be moved. So if it's a very high tide or we get a very strong hurricane, it can easily wash out those nests. Of course, they have predators. So raccoons are a pretty big predator for these guys. So that makes it extremely important to pick up our trash and food items off the beach, because that is what attracts raccoons to the area. And oftentimes they can take these nests and chicks. Other avian predators, so laughing gulls, will oftentimes take these eggs or chicks. Crows, owls are often a predator as well. Sometimes we'll see some snakes predating on it, mink in other areas, and ghost crabs. So ghost crabs will either break the eggs or they can snag a small chick that maybe had just been born. And so they can be a huge threat to these birds as well. So that brings me to recreational disturbance. I mentioned they have all these conservation challenges that they're facing for survival, or facing to survive, but then you throw recreational disturbance on top of that, and that is just another huge threat that can be preventable. So if anyone has watched the Field of Dreams movie with Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come. That's kind of what we say about coastal development as well. So these are two South Carolina beaches. The one on the left is Myrtle Beach. The one on the right is Folly. And for folks who have experienced the summertime on the beach here in South Carolina, this is pretty typical. There's a lot of people on the beach, a lot going on. Oftentimes birds just don't have the space to rest or nest that they need. So every little place that has natural habitat is extremely important, because if we build it, people will come and our wildlife will unfortunately leave. And that includes not just birds. We have sea turtles, horseshoe crabs, and of course our native plants and vegetation that depend on our beaches for survival. So something that gave credence to a lot of the human disturbance work along the Atlantic Flyway was the Atlantic Flyway Disturbance Project. And the first step to a lot of scientific studies is a literature review. And so the lit review for this disturbance project found 632 citations just referencing human disturbance and how it affected birds. And what they found was that across all life cycles of these birds in this study, human disturbance negatively impacted the shorebirds. And so knowing that, we were able to identify kind of what activities were human disturbance. And so pretty much it's anything that we do for fun on the beach can have a negative impact on shorebirds unless we do it responsibly. So recreating responsibly in a way that protects wildlife as well. But anything we do on the beach, that includes riding bikes, shoring up our boats too close to birds. Dogs are a big one. Driving on the beach, especially here in South Carolina, we have a lot of beach patrols, lifeguards, things like that, taking golf carts on the beach, which can be a threat. Flying kites and drones can also be a pretty big threat to these birds. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But knowing all of that, what can we do to help prevent that? And that is where stewardship comes in. So what is shorebird stewardship? It can look different for everyone and at every site. But this is a picture of one steward on the far left pointing out some birds to some visitors on their bikes. All right, go to the next slide. So kind of the foundation of all of our work is this quote that I heard. I'm not sure who to attribute it to, but conservation begins with human awareness. So what we found from stewarding over the years is that most beachgoers aren't purposefully disturbing the birds. They just aren't aware of what this disturbance means for the survival of these birds. So I mentioned stewarding looks different at every site and for every person. You can often, at most of our sites, we often have this sign that says, ask me about the birds, that helps bring people to your area to be able to talk about these birds and show them, whether you have a scope or binoculars or some printed photos. It helps to be able to show people what the birds actually look like, because with those smaller birds like the Wilson's plover, the piping plover, you may not be able to see them on the beach, especially if they're far away. So it is helpful to include people and show them what you're looking at. It can also look like this. You have a beach chair on the beach because some sites aren't as busy as other sites. And we'll talk about some of the things you should bring to the beach while you're volunteering. But it looks different across all sites, but the main overall goal is to prevent that human disturbance through education and awareness. And so we have what are called stewarding seasons. We have birds on the beach year round, but a lot of times we try to coincide our volunteer stewardship efforts with the time of the year where these birds are most disturbed. And so hopefully one day we will have year-round stewardship, which we do have at some sites. But right now, our big focus, especially for folks watching this training in the spring, is going to be our migratory and nesting birds. Of course, summer holidays, we do a huge push for help because it gets very, very busy during Memorial Day, July 4th, and Labor Day, which is oftentimes when these birds are stopping over on our beaches or are nesting on our beaches. So some common disturbances that you're going to see for all of these shorebirds and seabirds, no matter what time of year, no matter what site you're at, we'll talk through some of those common disturbances. So number one, flushing birds. And flushing birds just means scaring birds up and into flight. So that can mean, like in this top picture right here with these black skimmers, walking through a flock that are hanging out on the shoreline. Oftentimes that means they're foraging for food. So most people think it's pretty cool to cause the birds to fly up because then they get to see them fly off and see what their wings look like underneath, and they're taking photos like this guy in this top photo. But what that does is it causes a huge depletion in energy, especially for those migratory birds that are coming from South America, that are coming down in the fall from their Arctic breeding grounds. It causes them to have to fly up and escape from what they see as a predator. And it takes time away from them feeding, and it takes time away from them nesting. But then for our nesting shorebirds and seabirds, when humans flush these birds, so if they come too close to a nesting colony, or they scare off the plovers and cause them to do a broken wing display, what that does is it leaves the eggs exposed to the hot sun. And remember, those eggs are laid right on top of the sand. It exposes those eggs to the hot sun and to predators nearby. So if the adult birds are flying off the nest, to defend against what they see as a predator, so humans or dogs or an actual predator. They're going to leave those eggs and chicks exposed to other actual predators in the area. Dogs can be a very big issue. Something we like to say is that even friendly dogs can frighten birds, because dogs are cousins of coyotes, and coyotes are a natural predator to these birds. So they see dogs as coyotes. No matter how big or small or friendly your dog may be, it can cause huge issues for those migratory birds. So again, dogs, especially off-leash dogs, can flush those flocks of birds and cause their energy to deplete and take time away from them foraging. But in this example, it can also destroy a colony or a nest, a shorebird nest. So this is a colony in Florida. And if you can see in this picture, you see the wooden stakes coming up out of the sand. This small colony hosted about 60 least turn nests. And there was a beachgoer who had her 2 dogs off leash. The volunteer steward that was in this area addressed the dog owner, asked her to please leash her dog, talked to her about why. All of that took about 2 or 3 minutes, but in those 2 or 3 minutes, this colony of 60 went down to 6. So it only takes 1 dog, and it only takes about a minute for a colony or a shorebird nest to be absolutely destroyed. And so that is what we're out there to prevent. Drones have become an increasing concern in recent years, especially since they've become a little bit cheaper. So we've got more folks that are recreationally using drones, but to birds, they look like avian predators. So especially for those huge flocks of birds, we want to make sure people are kindly moving their drones away from those flocks of birds and near colonies of birds. So those nesting birds, especially seabirds that are nesting in big colonies, if they feel threatened or repeatedly threatened by what they perceive as a predator, they can completely abandon the colony. So in this example here, this was out of California at an elegant tern colony back in 2021. A recreational drone crashed into an elegant tern colony. And you can see in this picture, the impact caused a couple of eggs to break, but it was enough to scare the entire colony of about 1,500 nests to flee the area. So it didn't take long, 1 crash. I'm not sure if they ever caught the person that crashed the drone, but it caused thousands of birds to lose their eggs, which was a huge disappointment for this species in California. So something to be on the lookout. If you see drones, some sites don't allow drones at all, like state parks, or if you're near an airport, they're not allowed within 5-mile radius of an airport. But some sites don't have very clear rules against drones. So should you come across someone that has a drone and you're not sure of the drone rules or regulations in that area, it is best to kindly ask them to take their drone further down the beach to be able to leave these birds undisturbed. Some other really common disturbances here in South Carolina are boats. So folks will oftentimes shore up their boats on the sand and not realize that they're really close to nesting shorebirds, or they'll disturb a flock of birds that may be foraging in that wet sand. Kites, similar to drones, look like avian predators, and there are even kites nowadays that are designed to look like birds, which can be great for kids that might be interested in birds. But if they're flying too close to a flock or a nesting site, it can be very dangerous, cause a lot of disturbance. So the best way to address that is to ask them to kindly move down the beach. Helicopters and airplanes, not quite something we can always address, but if there is repeated disturbance from a helicopter that is not Coast Guard, which are the big orange helicopters. But for example, in this photo, this was an eco-tour operator that was continuously flying over a least tern colony in the state. And reports from volunteers, like those watching this video, with that, we were able to contact the eco-tour agency and ask them to please not fly that low, especially during nesting season. So just taking note, or maybe even taking a photo of the helicopter if you feel safe enough to do so, is great to report so that we are able to contact the agency and work through asking them not to do that. People walking through roped off areas is a concern, especially if there's a storm that may knock down some of these signs that we put up. So just being able to take photos of potential, of people who potentially have walked through the site, especially if you can take a photo and note where and when you took the photo just so we can kind of see maybe why they walked through it. Was a string broken? Was a sign down? Do we need to put up more signs? Things like that. But people walking through nesting sites obviously can easily step on those eggs. It can scare a colony of birds really easily. But especially for our shorebirds who are more cryptic nesters, people may not be able to see the eggs or the chicks at all, so they can easily step on them. Setting up too close to a nesting area. So again, that symbolic fencing that we put up throughout the season, birds aren't going to pay attention to signs. So if people are setting up right next to the signage, they typically don't know why the signs may even be there. They may not have read the sign. So it's important to try to catch folks before they set up for the day, because it's exponentially harder to get them to move all of their stuff once they have already set up and established that spot for the day. But if they're setting up way too close to the nesting area, that can just cause continuous disturbance to birds that might be nesting inside of that roped off area. Because they're wildlife, they aren't going to be reading our signs. They can put a nest as close to the signs as they want. So if a human sets up their umbrellas and their chairs for the day, if there is a nest that close to the posts, it can be disturbed throughout the day. And then finally, driving on the beach can be an issue. Luckily, we don't have as much recreational driving as some other states, but we do have security guards, beach patrol, lifeguards that oftentimes will take their golf carts out on the beach and just not realize that these birds are out there, especially when we have chicks running around. Remember, those shorebird chicks can run a couple miles, but oftentimes they can be foraging in the wet sand, hiding in that rack line for protection or shade. So it's very important if you see someone driving near a nesting area, or maybe even continuously driving through flocks of birds, to maybe ask them to stop. So we'll go through some stewarding do's and don'ts. So these come from years of experience and information and tips and tricks from stewards throughout the years. But some essential do's of all volunteer stewardship: you're going to need to be able to tolerate those beach conditions throughout the spring, summer, and fall. So it can get pretty hot. So it's just important to be able to remember that your body needs water. Always remember to bring more water than you think you'll need. Sunscreen, hat to prevent sunburn, a chair if you need one to take a break. Another important do be willing to educate and inspire. So again, we're not there to shame people or write tickets in any way. We're there to ask them to voluntarily comply and help us protect the shorebirds and seabirds. I mentioned this before, but to be able to guide views of the birds, you're going to want to point out, whether it be through scope or binoculars or a couple pictures, what these birds look like. Because if they're not able to kind of visualize what you're even talking about, they're not going to feel as connected to it. So that, again, giving people reasons to care about them. So all of those talking points, those stories we've talked about throughout this training, just kind of giving people reasons to care about the birds. And that can be as simple as asking people to share the responsibility of protecting our wildlife. Because the reason we get so many tourists and people moving to our coast is because it's absolutely beautiful. And so we want to preserve that for many, many years to come. And a part of that is protecting our wildlife. So asking them to share in the responsibility of protecting this wildlife for years to come can be a great way to engage people. Being a good neighbor, so especially if you're on one of those private islands that we have, asking them to be a good community member or neighbor while they're here visiting, or if they do live in the community, by helping protect these birds. And then, of course, a lot of our human communication is informal. So just having that friendly and positive attitude while you're talking to folks. We can oftentimes read body language. So if you don't seem interested in what you're talking about, the person you're talking to may not be interested in what you're talking about. Some stewarding don't. So again, we're not going to be mean to people. We're not enforcing the rules. We are there to ask folks to voluntarily comply with the rules that are already set up. Of course, one of the biggest things is we do not want to disturb the birds ourselves. So we do not want to get close to these birds. The way you can tell if you're getting too close to the birds is if they somehow change their behavior. So if you've got a flock of birds nearby, and you see them start to become more alert as you get closer, that means you're getting too close. If you see that broken wing display at all, if the colony flies up off their nest, that means you're too close to the birds. So you want to be aware of what the birds are doing at all times while you're on the beach. One, to just be able to teach the people about them and be able to show them the birds, but also to know that you are not disturbing the birds. And I mentioned this at the very beginning, we're not here to be experts. Everyone can learn enough to contribute to this effort of inspiring folks to care about shorebirds and seabirds. Some tips from some of our more experienced volunteers. Keep an eye on the birds, I just mentioned that. Kind of understanding the rules and regulations of your community to be able to know what can and can't happen at certain beaches. So especially those dog rules, you want to know what beaches cannot have dogs, what beaches require dogs to be on leashes, and that time of year that dogs may or may not be allowed. We're here to talk to beachgoers informally. So again, we don't want to be experts no matter how much or how little we know about birds. We want to be able to have a conversation with folks, not have a lecture, for lack of other word. But we want to be able to look for signs of curiosity, look for a way to make it more engaging. So again, showing people the birds. This is a good example of a photo. One of our fish and wildlife partners talking to someone and showing them through the scope what the birds look like. And that gives people a chance to experience what you're talking about. And something we want to remember while we're out there at all times is that while you are a steward, you are representing not only Audubon, but all of our shorebird partners. So you want to make sure, even if somebody comes across negatively or you have a negative interaction, you want to make sure you just kind of back off. People have bad days. You may just have run into someone that's having a bad day, may not want to talk to you, but you want to remember that you are representing a huge web of people working to protect these shorebirds and seabirds. Some other tips, something to start with two positives. So that's a great way to start off a conversation. You want to kind of listen to what people are saying, whether it be them telling you a story or asking questions. Starting with those two positives is a great way to get the conversation going. And then kind of making it a social norm. So we are very social creatures as humans. Saying something like, most people that come to this part of the beach will try to walk around the flock, or most people that come to this part of the beach know that we have some really cool nesting shorebirds here and we want to make sure we protect them. Making it normal for people who may not live in this area to do a certain behavior to protect the birds. And then finally, last little bit of pro tips. Again, having that sincere interest in just being out there, using analogies, so metaphors, things to relate to people as you're talking about the birds. And then one of our naturalist rangers said, use your Southern hospitality. So we are here in the South. We are known for our Southern hospitality. So just being polite, using your P's and Q's, as my parents used to say. And then this is a good example too of someone addressing a potential dog disturbance. So just going up to dog owners and not coming at them, running at them, asking them to please turn around. There are birds on the beach, but maybe asking them what kind of dog they have, what the dog's name is. You don't have to necessarily pet the dog, but just kind of approaching them with more positivity as opposed to running up to them and yelling some beach rules at them. So finally, I do want to mention your safety comes first. You don't ever want to put yourself in a negative situation. Like I mentioned, negative interactions can be rare while you're volunteering, but they can happen. So the best thing to do, back off, just give that person their space. If you need to report the violation to any beach security, to your local beach security or beach patrol, if you feel threatened, be sure to do that. And then, of course, we do have that COVID-19 precaution. We still want to make sure people feel safe. If you don't feel safe, if you feel sick, or if you feel like you don't want to put yourself at risk, you do not have to share your binoculars. You don't have to share your scope. Just do whatever makes you feel the safest, because your safety comes first. And that brings me to our next point. You want to make sure you want to be prepared. As I mentioned earlier, it gets really hot on our beaches in South Carolina. Bring more water than you think you'll need. That sunscreen, bug spray, hat, sunglasses, anything that makes you feel comfortable and protects you from the hot sun. Be aware of the weather. That's something that's not on here, but if it looks like it's going to be a strong storm, or if we have a hurricane predicted to come through, definitely do not go out. Feel free to contact me, cancel your shift. Again, your safety comes first. It's important. I always make sure people try to bring their cell phones to the beach, especially if you come across an emergency, if someone has a health emergency, if you yourself have a health emergency. But also it helps to take pictures, pull up pictures of birds, maybe show people some of the cool resources that we have on our website. All of our sites have volunteer vests, so the bright yellow vests, to communicate with beachgoers that you're there for a purpose. You're not just a random person coming up and talking to people. And then, of course, if you have binoculars, a scope, pictures for that phone, even if you print off pictures, that's a great way to communicate with people. And then sometimes people will bring a chair to be able to take a little break during their shift. So that is totally okay as well. And then, oops, we've got some key contacts. So of course, in the US, we have 911 emergency number. If you yourself feel sick, or if you see someone else feeling sick or getting violent, feel free to report that. Again, your safety comes first. You will have my email just from our website, but all volunteers, once they sign up for a shift, will have my phone number as well. Should anything come up or you need to cancel a shift or give me a call to report something, feel free to do that. This SCDNR Operation Game Thief, this is to report any violations to SCDNR. So especially DNR properties like Botany Bay, DeVoe Bank, Crab Bank, things like that, where you see a violation of somebody doing something they should not be, you can report that. If you feel safe enough to take a picture, you can take a picture of the violation. But if you don't feel safe, or if you feel like the person violating the rules could be very negative or become violent, do not take a picture. But you can call this number, you can text this tip and report it, or they have an app called SCDNR Game Thief that you can report your tips to. And then each site has different security patrols, or area beach patrols. So just knowing that, and then of course your site leader. So almost all of our sites have a site leader, and that's going to be the person that you directly coordinate with. I am located in Charleston, so I'm not always able to get to sites down in Beaufort, which is where we rely on site leaders to be able to communicate with local volunteers, to be able to show them around, give them information about their beach. So all sites that have a site leader, you will get their contact information after signing up for a shift. And so lastly, we will go over pretty quickly how to get started to be a volunteer shorebird steward. So you guys have already completed step one. You have watched this training. Thank you for sticking through it. I know it's a long training, but we do require all of our volunteers to have this training for all of us to be on the same page, have the same messaging, and understand the same and most recent research for our shorebirds and seabirds. Your next step is to fill out a liability form. So on our website, you can go to sc.audubon.org/coast, and you will see a spot where it says Shorebird Steward Volunteers. We have a link there for our liability forms. If you have any trouble finding it, this is where you will find this video. So they're located right next to this video on our website. We have one for adults and one for minors under the age of 18. So if you're bringing a child out to volunteer with you, which is great, we encourage families to volunteer together. Just be sure to fill out the appropriate liability form. You're going to go to the site link. So once you fill out that liability form, you will get a follow-up email with the link to sign up for shifts. So each site has different shifts. You want to make sure you click on the site that you want to volunteer at. You can either pick one site to stick with all summer, or you can switch up sites if you live in an area that has multiple sites. Totally up to you. Invite your friends and family. We want this to be a positive experience for everyone involved. So feel free to bring your friends, your family, or if you want to volunteer on your own, maybe meet some new folks, some new volunteers, feel free to do so. Have fun during your shift. So take these tips and tricks and information that you learned from this training and get out there on the beach. And then second to last, fill out your post-shift survey. So on our website where you see this training video and our liability form, we have a link to this post-shift survey. And it has a couple of different things where we collect data on who's volunteering, when you volunteered, what site you volunteered at, how many folks you talked to, what birds you saw, and what kind of disturbances that you saw. So we just want to be able to know what's going on and where, so that we can best move forward with our trainings maybe next season, or use that information however we can to be able to protect the birds. Oh, and so I have a couple of PowerPoints going crazy. We have a couple of screenshots here. This is what the web page looks like. So this ASC web page, this is the link you will get once you fill out your liability form. And you can see this example here. We have all of our sites listed that we have shifts for. Again, those Kiowa and Seabrook Islands have different coordinators for their programs. I'm happy to connect anyone that is interested in going to those sites. But the ones that I coordinate are here on this website. And they may change throughout the summer, depending on the birds. If there are birds nesting there at a site that we don't have listed, sometimes we will make that a new site and I will communicate that to volunteers. If there's a site listed and there are birds that happen to not be nesting or not be migrating through, we may not have volunteers at that site that year. But this is the site where all these shift links will live. You will click on the site that you're interested in signing up for. And you can see down here below, we have our liability forms. So our liability forms live where you found this training video on that same web page. You can find those here as well. The Shorebird Steward certificate, I'll talk about in just a second. The post-shift survey, so this link will stay the same throughout the summer. Bookmark this page to make it easier to fill out your post-shift survey. You can even fill it out while you're on the beach towards the end of your shift to make sure you remember. This is very important. All this data that we collect from these shift surveys is extremely important, not only to improve our program, but to help protect these birds. So if we're noticing that volunteers are reporting a bunch of drone disturbances at a certain site, we can work together with community partners to help address reasons why there might be a bunch of drones at a certain site. That's just an example, but we do use this data and it is very important to remember to fill it out. We have a list of what kind of incentives we offer. We do have a Facebook group. If you are on Facebook, feel free to join that. The only thing I ask for that is to make sure you fill out the one question that I ask is, have you watched a Shorebird Steward training? And that is how I know that you are a Shorebird Steward. We want to make sure that group is specifically for Shorebird Stewards. So I do monitor that pretty closely, but it is a great way to connect with other volunteers, share photos, share stories, ask questions, things like that. And then one of our partners developed this app called Tangled in Trash. So if you see any wildlife, not even just birds, but any wildlife that has been entangled in trash, which is something we unfortunately do see throughout the year, this is a great way to report that so we can know where the wildlife is and how we can help them. But with all that being said, once you come to this site, after you fill out a liability form, this is where that link will take you. You click on the site where you want to volunteer. So as an example, I clicked on Huntington Beach State Park, and this is what it will look like when you come to this sign up page. So it'll have the address for the location that you can go to. It has the sign up here on the right side. You'll fill out your first name, your last name, your email, and your phone number. This phone number is important because if I need to contact you for any reason, whether it be there's a report of bad weather coming in, I want to make sure you don't take your shift that day, for whatever safety reason, it's important that I do have your phone number. And then below that, you'll see available times. So this is where you'll know where the shifts are for your site. So each site is different. As I mentioned, they all have different times. They're all very unique. So for example, this Huntington Beach State Park has shifts on Saturdays and Sundays from 9 a.m. to 12:30 and 12:15 to 3:45. We do encourage folks to volunteer in pairs. So we have 2 slots available for each shift at every site, sometimes 3 slots, it depends on the site. But what you'll do is for the shift that you want to work, and you can click on multiple shifts at one time, but I am going to be organizing it by month this year. So you'll see 1 month at a time for shift times. You click which times you want in this little orange box, and you click sign up. And so that will send you a follow-up email to remind you of the times. This mobilized site will send a reminder email for your shift before, I think it's about 48 hours before your shift to remind you that you have a shift coming up. And then if you go back to the left side of this page, if you scroll down a little further, you can read all the details for each site. So I do have a lot of important details in this information, so please be sure to read through it. especially if you're a new volunteer. So, for example, at Huntington Beach State Park, it will tell you that your sign up will notify our site leaders at that site, because this site in particular, you need transportation to the nesting site. So it is important that you sign up to be able to allow the volunteer leaders to know that you need a ride on a certain day. But all of our shifts are listed out. Once you sign up, they will get a notification that you've signed up. It also has links to this training video, as well as the liability forms, in case you forgot to fill those out, or if you wanted to refresh yourself on some of the information in this training video. It has a reminder of where to park, what to bring. So each site is different in this description, depending on the site, but it is important that you look through it, especially if you're a new volunteer. And then you can sign up to get automated text. You absolutely do not have to do that. So make sure, if you don't want text or anything from the Mobilize website, make sure you uncheck this orange box here at the bottom. But with that, you click sign up, and then you do your shift. And then at the end of your shift, you will fill out this Shorebird Steward shift survey. And so again, it is important to either bookmark that link that I mentioned before, but this shift survey link will stay the same. So it will stay the same throughout the summer. So you can just click on it each time you finish up a shift, but this is what it looks like. I might change a few things around this year, question-wise, to make it a little easier to fill out, but it's going to ask you essentially the same information as the screenshot from the one from last year. Your name is required, postal code, not required, but it lets us know what area you were in. And then your email, of course. Again, if you don't want these email updates, please uncheck these boxes. But what you're going to be filling out is the date of your shift, what time your shift was, and where your shift was at. And then if you scroll down a little further, you'll see these other boxes here. So estimated total number of people you saw on the beach, and then how many of those people you talked to. So that gives us an idea of how many percentage-wise you were talking to people on the beach, and just how busy that beach may be. How many dogs did you see? So leashed and unleashed. So being able to note that is really important. And I will likely include some other disturbances on here. So did you see any other disturbances? And I'll put a little box where you can note those. Select the birds you saw during your shift. So this just helps us get an idea of what birds are doing and where at our stewardship site. And then of course, the last box is optional. Comments on your shift, good and bad. Did you have a good shift? Did something happen that you want to let me know about? If you want to make note of any other birds you saw, I love knowing what other birds were out on the beach. But again, with these last two things are optional, because if you don't feel comfortable identifying the birds, you do not have to let me know what birds you saw. This is more just for me to understand kind of what birds are doing and where throughout the season, so we can adapt our training to fit that. I mentioned earlier this Shorebird Steward certificate. So this is completely optional as well, but with a $20 donation that goes to our coastal program, so it helps support all of this awesome work that we're able to do throughout the year. You send in the $20 on our website. We have a link to this option on our website. You will answer a 10-question quiz with questions specific to this training. So if you have watched this training and learned from this training, you will be able to easily answer these 10 questions. If you get some wrong, don't worry, that's okay. I will send back the correct answers and reasons for those answers to hopefully help you learn, in case you did get an answer wrong, to help you learn why the answer was wrong. And then after that, I will send you a certificate in the mail to show that not only did you donate to our program, but you did go through this training. And again, this is completely optional. You do not have to do this to be a Shorebird Steward. And then, of course, we do like to show some appreciation for our volunteers, because they are such an important part of coastal conservation. We have a couple of incentives that we do provide to volunteers. So when someone works 6 shifts, and this can be throughout the summer, it doesn't have to be in a certain time period. Once you work 6 shifts, you can get a family pass to our Bidler Forest. It has a very long boardwalk. It has a lot of great bird photos, or I'm sorry, bird viewing opportunities. And it is the oldest virgin cypress tupelo swamp in the world. So it's a pretty incredible place. A ton of really old trees that are just absolutely beautiful. The staff out there is incredible. They are very knowledgeable. So once you work 6 shifts, you can get a Beidler Forest Family Pass. Once you work 8 shifts, you get a Reciprocity Pass. So that pass gets you into lots of different Charleston area attractions for free. And so I have a document where I will detail exactly where you can get in for free, but it's all Charleston area museums, plantations, the aquarium, national historical sites. So like Fort Sumter, you can get in for free. And then this year we'll be doing the monthly shift report raffle like we did last year. So what that is, it's pretty simple. Each time you submit your shift report, your name gets put into a raffle drawing that I will pull a name from every month. And so that winner for the month will get a prize, whether it be a framed photo, a t-shirt, whatever prizes I can get creative with this year. It's a way to help encourage folks to fill out that shift report, and just another way to say thank you for helping us collect all that awesome data and getting out on the beach and talking to all those folks. Some more opportunities I wanted to make sure people were aware of. Just holiday stewarding. If you are prioritizing your time with volunteering with us, the most help we need is around the holidays. So Memorial Day, July 4th, and Labor Day. So if you have a very limited amount of time to be able to volunteer, those holiday stewards are going to be extremely helpful. Education stewards, so we run student programs throughout the fall and spring. I'm always looking for help from volunteers who may want to help me out with those. You go through a different training or a shadowing opportunity, so coming to watch me do an educational program and then helping me out with that. We do a lot of advocacy work here in the state. And this is a date, if you happen to be watching this training after April 5th, please ignore that date. But we have an upcoming lobby day at the time of this recording. And then our Beidler Forest, so I mentioned the old growth cypress tupelo swamp. They're also looking for volunteers to help out at Beidler Forest in different capacities, whether that be greeting guests, some maintenance work, helping take care of the animals out there, things like that. If you're interested in any of these opportunities, feel free to let me know and I can get you connected to the appropriate contact for our advocacy work, for our Beidler Forest work, and then I can talk you through holiday and education programming as well. And with that, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you all for sticking it out. It's time to get out there and educate. So this is a long-billed curlew, a species we don't often see here in South Carolina, but he's doing an awesome education strut. So it's time to get out there and educate. And I do want to say welcome to the flock to any new volunteers that may be watching this. We are a great community of stewards doing a lot of great work to help protect these shorebirds and seabirds. So if you have any other questions that I can help answer, feel free to reach out to me. My name is Alyssa Zabrowski. My email is on the website where you found this video. So feel free to reach out and hope to see you on the beach. Thanks, everyone.